Welcome. We'd like to welcome you to our series of conversations on biopolitics and democracy. These conversations explore the political tensions we're experiencing in these times of pandemic. Our intention is to discuss the biopolitical stakes of the ways in which states and society face the current global health crisis and understand how the pandemic is transforming our forms of life. We'd also like to propose a critical exercise of imagination for possible futures after the pandemic. It is a great pleasure to have Florence Caeymaex with us today. Thanks for joining us, Florence.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
It's our pleasure. Florence Caeymaex is a researcher at the Belgian National Fund for Scientific Research, professor of political philosophy and ethics at the University of Liège, and vice chair of the Belgian Advisory Committee on Bioethics. She has published widely on contemporary philosophy, looking at the political and ethical issues regarding life, the life sciences, biomedicine, and technologies. Her latest book, Habiter le trouble avec Don Haraway, from 2019, was co-edited with Vincent Desprez and Julien Pierron. Florence wrote the introduction and an essay titled La politique des savoirs assujettis, l'écriture et la guerre, in the context of this book. So I will ask the first question, and perhaps I'll begin by asking you, Florence, to maybe tell us a bit more about the Belgian Advisory Committee on Bioethics. What have you been experiencing since the beginnings of the pandemic as the vice chair of this committee? And do you think that this experience gives you a certain or particular point of view on the biopolitical implications of the pandemic?
All right. It does indeed give a particular point of view, and I should say it's a privileged one. Before explaining that, I would like to explain first what sort of institution the Belgian Advisory Committee on Bioethics is. So this committee was established in 1993. In these years, many European countries took the same path, actually. And it is the result in Belgium of a cooperation agreement that was signed by the federal government of Belgium and the regional governments, but it is completely independent of the authorities that created that institution. The committee is now composed with about 78 members, about half effective, half deputies, but everyone is welcome to contribute equally. And our mission is twofold. First is to provide opinions on the problems raised by research and research applications in the fields of biology, medicine, and healthcare. The ethical, social, and legal aspects of these problems are studied also, particularly from the angle of respect for human rights. And this is very important to us. And our second mission is to inform the public and the government authorities about these problems. As most of the official ethics committees in Europe and in the world, we send our advices called opinions to those who have submitted the questions, to the public authorities, and we make them available to the public through our website. This is the information of the public side of the thing. So it is necessary maybe to say, what is it to provide an ethical stance in times of pandemic? We mainly discuss public health measures, such as mass vaccination, the use of COVID passes and other sanitary measures, pediatric vaccination, mandatory vaccination, closure of retirement homes, for example. And we also discussed the question of equal access to healthcare services in the critical context of saturated hospitals. So we discussed the very sensitive question about what happened for old people confined in retirement homes that could not go to hospitals. This was particularly critical in Belgium in 2020. We also discussed the no less difficult question of the prioritization of patients if we fell short of beds, as it was put in many countries. So providing ethical views or providing ethical view means, I think, to appreciate these issues regarding their benefits or risks for individuals and society as a whole, in light of solidarity, social justice, social security, equality, beneficence, non-discrimination, etc. Of course, we also take in account the measures in terms of public health efficiency or in legal terms, but we add something that are, I would say, values. I'll come back to that later. And here, not only the classical biomedical ethics values, such as, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, or justice, but also values that are the core of our, I think, explicit or implicit social contract, so to say. These are, for example, social security, social justice, solidarity, and so on. So we try to appraise the legitimacy or the rightness of such measures in light of their meaning or significance, not only in terms of their efficiency, in terms of what we consider the core values for maintaining social bonds and livable individual existence. The ethical, in this regard, communicates with the political, I would say. It's very difficult to do, and it's also very challenging. I'd like to stress the fact that besides medical and public health sciences data, social sciences and humanities knowledge, as well as information from the terrain, is here indispensable. It should always be part of the ethical reflection, but it's even more true in a pandemic, I think. And now let's say a word about what my point of view was. It must be said that it was a privileged standpoint that was not accessible to everyone. We suddenly found ourselves placed at crossroads, first in terms of sciences, of knowledges, I would say medical, public health sciences, social sciences and humanities, law, and all the knowledge produced by official bodies. Second, because we have been situated at the crossroads of governmental institutions, academic world, ad hoc experts bodies appointed by the government, health authorities, different medical associations, the medias, and some civil society bodies. And I must say it's a great chance. It does not mean I see everything or things from above, but it is still a partial point of view, but it's a privileged one. It's possible to say that from that privileged standpoint, we could observe an unprecedented public debate and somehow knowledge production everywhere. It's not accurate to say that the public debate was intentionally hampered or confiscated, or that it has been converted into a mere division between a governmental and expert authoritarian consensus on the one hand, and public opinion on the other hand. What we need to start from is the fact that the public debate was in fact spread in many places, and that the dissensus was everywhere and not located in a fault line separating society from the political institutional apparatuses. In particular, there has never been a consensus within the political institutional apparatuses which I belong to, I must say. I spent some time with the government experts group that was in charge of sanitary measures for a moment. It was very interesting. It was very interesting to see conflicting rationalities at work. For example, between the social psychologists I felt quite close to and the economy experts. We really didn't have the same point of view, and we had to spend some time to, let's say, build common problems and a common discourse, and it takes some time, and we didn't have time, so it was really challenging. If I say this, though, this is not to say, of course, that everything was ideal and perfect. For instance, it is true that exception procedures have replaced parliament's debates too long and for too many issues in many countries, and we have to learn from that. It's also true that the many voices have not been heard sufficiently equally. I personally know people who work in close contact with economically fragile people, or with people living in closed communities, such as refugees, disabled persons, old persons in retirement homes, psychiatry institutions, and so on. And they have a lot to say, and they have not been heard enough, I believe. It's also true that uncertainty and dissensus did not follow the outlines of social groups and classes antagonisms, but divided the usually close communities. The trouble, I would say, was also, or even in us. I was not too sure at certain moments about what to think, and many encounters became quite emotional, because when it came, for example, to vaccination, I had like quarrels with many friends or colleagues. And I think we should learn from that also. But the main lesson I draw is that what we call a public debate is inevitably local, partial, and distributed, and that we should start from there to question and rebuild our democratic institutions in a broad sense. So this might be for, let's say, the imagination part of the exercise. So I could get back to it later on. So that was my first my first point, and I still have something to say about that. That situation. I think it's important to say, and that we will have to reflect on that in the future. It's important to say that the pandemic has shown first unprecedented evidence of collective uncertainty in the Northwestern countries. It's important to stress that many people in the global South experience that sort of uncertainty all the time: climate, industrial hazards, epidemics, political instability, and suddenly it became our reality too, and we were unprepared to that. And I think it's a very good lesson for the future, because we can expect that, like the climate change will send us some similar challenges in the future. And the second point, it's also important to shed light on the fact that the sudden hyper visibility of epidemiology, virology, and the vaccines, unprecedented evidence of the importance of science and technologies in our lives appeared. And it's something that is well known by experts of private companies, of course, governments, scholars, etc., that science and technologies are at the core of our societies. But most of the time, this is kept from the eye of the lay public, or presented as a remote issue and far from day-to-day common issues. There's lots of things said publicly about the space conquest, but it's far remote from our day-to-day or everyday life. And this time, sciences and technologies just, tumbled in our everyday lives. And I think that's a change. And this should be taken in account, because it's the first time, it's really new. So that's my first answer to your question.
Thank you, Florence. It's fascinating, and I guess that I'm wondering, from your standpoint, from the kind of privileged standpoint that you had during the past months and couple of years, do you think the idea of biopolitics helps us to understand some aspects, at least, of what is going on? And the project that we have focuses on biopolitical aspects of the pandemic, and we particularly wanted to stress the problematic clash between securitarian mechanisms on the one hand and the protection of democratic rights and freedoms on the other. What is your take on this? What do you think is going on there? And do you think that the idea, the concept of biopolitics is still somehow important for us or helpful?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that Foucault's scholars have a lot to do here. And this is not to say to just revive, let's say, the classical understanding of biopolitics. So your question is about what signification we want to give to Foucault's work and his understanding of biopolitics. I think Foucault has passed on different lessons to us. His work on biopolitics in a broad sense should be taken, I think, as an open work to be continued and as a call and a claim for research, not as a final homogeneous political doctrine about the exercise of power in contemporary societies. I think some historical analysis remain very interesting in times of pandemic, and I'd like to give some example. We should remember, for instance, the difference between the management of the leprosis versus the management of the plague as an illustration of the difference between the great confinement and the discipline in Discipline and Punish. I think we should remember also and get back to the very interesting illustration of the security technologies he gave in security technologies population in the 1978 course at the Collège de France. In the third lesson of January 1978, he examines the management of the smallpox through inoculation, vaccination, and public health measures in the 18th and 19th century. And he shows how security practices are put in place and how these practices and knowledges generates a certain understanding of the population individual practices or population individual relation, and that's the notion of a case, a certain understanding in terms of risk, supported by probabilistic reasoning, a new understanding of danger and prevention, and the sudden general significance given to the notion of crisis that appeared in that moment. So I think it's very important to picture a genealogy of our societies and our mechanism. But I think it is also insufficient, and I think it should remain, okay, it could remain very interesting if it is the lever for further research. It would be insufficient to say that we assisted to the return of the disciplines or to qualify the pandemic governmentality as a mere securitarian, it's difficult to say, securitarian one. I think it is urgent to actualize the research and to ask what sort of biopolitics has now emerged. Historians have usefully continued to explore the management of epidemics and pandemics, and they have been inspired by Foucault. For example, a woman, a historian named Françoise Hildesheimer, she explained the changes that affected the sanitary policies in the 19th century, making them very different from the 18th century policies described by Foucault. She said or explained that the emergence of public health policies in the proper sense were based on a solidaristic system of obligations that was completely absent in the 18th century. She explained also that the cholera epidemic in the 1830s in Europe made space to think the social causes of the propagation and so forth. And this calls for more research because we need a complex picture of what happened to us. And of course, all the work that has been done on the recent epidemics or pandemics at the end of the 20th century is very important. So it's a way to complexify and renew the concept of biopolitics. So biopolitics has to be explained and is not an explainer in itself somehow. And in this sense, I would like to step aside from a certain understanding of biopolitics, especially the one that was endorsed by Giorgio Agamben in the very beginning of the pandemic. I don't know how it was in the UK or other countries, but in France, you may know that Agamben published a text on the website Lundi Matin, a very controversial column presenting the lockdown as the inevitable authoritarian drift of generalized biopolitics that was located inside our democracies. I think it is very tempting to see the unprecedented scale of the sanitary measures, again, unprecedented for the North, right? To see it as a revelation of a pervasive and long-standing biopolitical government focused on the maximization of power and control over life and the living. And it is indeed the fact that some interpretations tend to suggest that biopower is somehow the truth in the last analysis of what we erroneously see as democratic societies. Something that the pandemic has supposedly played a revealing role, if not an accelerating role, for such biopolitical rationality endorsed by governments. And some see that this is coupled, of course, with the powers of the big pharma industry or other capitalistic forces. And I think that from this point of view, individual and collective disobedience seems to be the only possible political attitude regarding such power, a power that is tendentially totalitarian. And I think, unfortunately, this interpretation has gained ground. And again, at this very moment, we had very strong demonstrations in Brussels yesterday with more than 50,000 people. The organizer says 500,000. And I would not say they, they affiliate themselves with Foucault, but in fact, I think this sort of interpretation of biopolitics is now, pervading different milieus, and I think it's very problematic. And I think, as Foucault scholars, I think we should keep from such use of his views and works for many reasons. And the first one is because there are, at the moment, many empirical evidences of the opposite scenario. We observed many failures, approximate and hesitating governmental responses, changing strategies, insisting dilemmas, political conflicts, and also disparities between public health systems. So instead of a coherent, overwhelming biopolitical system of sanitary institutions and measures, like as if it were an archipelago, of sanitary forces, we faced difficulties of all sorts, political conflicts, fault lines within society. And we have to explore them and learn from that, and not from the hypothesis of, an overwhelming biopolitics. In this regard, it is perhaps useful to get back to, I think, Didier Fassin's work. Fassin, he's a physician and also an anthropologist. Fassin identified important shifts in contemporary biopolitics, looking at the contemporary situations in terms of bio-legitimacy. And more than the power over life, he says contemporary societies are characterized by the legitimacy they attach to life. This is the first point. He also says that rather than a normalizing process, the intervention in lives is a production of inequalities. And in the end, he says that the politics of life is not only a question of governmentality and technologies, but also of meaning and values. And this is particularly important for us who do, things from a bioethics and politics point of view. In this perspective, I think we have experienced a politically significant contradiction. On the one hand, the imperative of protecting the lives at all costs, and on the other hand, the factual evidence of sex, gender, class or social status and race hierarchies that made some lives completely unequal. And these lives paid a different tribute to the pandemic. I think Fassin says that African Americans represent 40% of the death caused by COVID, but only 10% of the US population as a whole. So it's a striking data about who really paid the tribute to the pandemic. And this brings us back to what really calls attention, I think, which are not only power relations or the exercise of power from a government, but power relations within society that are driven by inequalities. And we'd better recall the other and probably more faithful or accurate lesson Foucault passed down to us. Foucault invited us to decipher power relations outside the sphere of the state. His aim, I think, was to dislocate the political and to open new spaces and places for political conflictualities. And I think the pandemic should bring us to reopen political conflictualities where they have been actively ignored in the last decades, I would say. For example, public services, healthcare systems, cultural and social segregations. We need to reopen conflictualities, and this means in-depth analysis of them and not minimizing them. And on the other hand, it means also domesticating them, because I think we should see part of the strong counter movement we observe at the moment in the pandemic, like big demonstrations like the one I was talking about in Brussels yesterday. I think it contains a certain amount of this conflictuality, but I think this conflictuality should be understood, reoriented, and rendered politically intelligible, because it's not enough politically intelligible. And the way it is converted by, let's say, the dominant discourse about, ignorant people, or let's say people who have an immoral behavior and that don't understand solidarity and so on, it's not a good way to render the situation politically intelligible. So what we need is to rebuild the political intelligibility for that. And if we don't do that, the only alternative is just to comply silently or to disobey. And I think disobey is not, is not a very interesting path, because mostly it is an individual attitude and not a solidarity one. And what we need to rebuild is, I think, somehow solidarity, I would say. And I think one of the places where this political conflictuality is very important to rebuild is the archipelago of the care institutions and practices, and of course hospital, some welfare state institutions, and certainly the type of social contract we have today with the big pharma, as people say. I think it's very important because it's destroying our welfare and healthcare services at the moment. So this is a way to catch up with the critique that is developing within society that has been developing within society for 2 years, but that was converted in some sort of a mere let's say opposition counter movement that has to find its political way.
Thanks, Florence. That was very interesting. Our next question, I think, in the few minutes we have left, I think they build upon what you said about biopolitics being renewed by these mechanisms that are changed and by the analysis of a singular moment in history that we find ourselves in. And also, you mentioned the idea of using this biopolitical framework to reopen political conflictualities and somehow rebuild solidarity. So I think our next question is, how do you imagine, based on that, future scenarios for critique and collective action and solidarity under this light?
I said something about the public debate in the beginning, and I think that's one thing we should build on that. So to accept that political debate is inevitably local, partial, and distributed. And I think this would be very useful to us to expand a certain, let's say, spontaneous model that that was built during the pandemic by many people. I'll take an example or an illustration. I had the chance to speak many times with the general practitioners associations, and also with some people who develop, an alternative organization of primary care and general practice offices. And it's very interesting because they had controversies inside, because of course, there are people who support some sort of an alternative way to provide healthcare services to the population and to individuals. And so it's a milieu that is very open to critique, and that has lots of reservations about the way the governments implemented the measures. And because they are everyday, in their everyday life and practice, in close contact with people. And so they really they wanted something else, and they had very strong controversies about vaccination, for example. I don't even say mandatory vaccination or passes, sanitary, or let's say passes, COVID passes. And we had lots of discussions, and I thought this is very interesting, because we need places where people can rebuild their own rationality positions, and where, like safe spaces where you can express yourself and sometimes change your mind, and sometimes have people follow you on certain points, or even to consolidate the critique. So I think that's one point, and we should multiply those spaces, local spots where people could learn from each other and build shareable knowledge about what affects them really. So, and I think we need some more distributed institutions to do that. I know some politicians are building that sort of stuff in Belgium, in many local communities, but we need to consolidate such dispositif in French. The second thing is, I would say, let's say that that's the second suggestion, and it will be over, is what I draw from my experience in the bioethics committee. I think politically there is an importance to draw a figure of what kind of society we could aspire to provide, I would say, meaning and significance. And this has been, I think, absolutely absent from the political discourse in the last months. And it's a pity, because they don't even explain what do they prefer, why they choose that option instead of that other option. They will always explain things in terms of efficiency, but they don't give, let's say, the scientific rationale, but they don't neither give the expectations and to what sort of values or meaningful horizons this is linked to. And this is a very important point. And I think that what made a difference between, let's say, the classical experts' works and the works that the bioethics committees in different countries did in the late months. So, and come back with notions such as, solidarity, and even, why not, obligations. What is the obligation? Not obligations between individuals or obligations from individuals towards society, but also what are the obligations of the state towards the population, towards the people, and so on. So I think these meaningful words, we should claim or reclaim these words for us who believe in the critique of our present times. That's what I think.
Thank you so much, Florence. This was fascinating, and unfortunately, we ran out of time. But
I know. I was too long, wasn't I?
No, you had so many interesting things to say. So we're really happy and grateful for your time. Thanks so much again, and thanks everyone who watched the video. Please check out our website for other videos about biopolitics and democracy. And Florence, good luck with your work in the bioethics committee and with your work as a researcher. It was a pleasure to have you.
Okay, same for you. And thank you very much for this invitation. I'm honored and pleased.
Thank you.
Goodbye.